McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, I'm Dennis McCuistion. Welcome to the program. Sitting here with my co-host, Jim Falk. And Jim, on last week's program, we talked about the history of the Electoral College. So what do you think we ought to do this week?
Well, I think since we're just a few months out from the election, no doubt a year from now, people are going to be talking about what role the Electoral College played. So let's see what we have to say about it.
I think you're right. You know, as many of you may know, there are strong sentiments in America to either change the way we elect our president via the Electoral College, or to simply do away with it and let the people vote popularly, so to speak. Should the Electoral College be changed? Well, that's the question we'll focus on, and we hope you watched the prior program that we talked about on the history. And speaking of perspective, here to provide it are two outstanding individuals who were in the audience of that program that we taped. And first is Tom Brunell. Tom Brunell is professor of political science at the University of Texas at Dallas, where he specializes in elections, redistricting, and of course the Electoral College. Tom, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Dennis.
It's been a while. And Matt, you've been here with us before as well. Matt Wilson is associate professor of political science at SMU, where his focus is on elections, public opinion, religion, and politics. That's quite a combination there, Matt, if I do say so myself.
No shortage of things to talk about.
I'm certainly hoping that you have different classes in different subjects as opposed to combining politics and religion. Now, since you were here at that last program, why don't you give that viewer who didn't get to see it just a brief synopsis of the history of the Electoral College?
Well, the Electoral College was developed in the Constitutional Convention in 1787 as the founders were searching for a way to choose the president where there would be involvement from the various states and recognize the states as their own sovereign entities, and at the same time allowing for some of the wiser leading figures at the time to have input into who might make a good candidate for the presidency. So they wanted some level of popular involvement with government, but they thought that a little democracy goes a long way. So the Electoral College was a way of kind of tempering the democratic sentiments of the revolution with some role for elites and the kind of wiser, respected elder statesmen of the day as well.
Now, you talked about Democrat, and you didn't really mention the word Republican necessarily, but we did in that last program about Democrat and Republican. Give us a little sense of the differences with D with a little d and R with a little r.
Sure. Well, the Electoral College reflects the fact that we are a republic and not a pure democracy. And so the idea behind a republic is that the people have a voice, but that it is not simply a straightforward one person, one vote concept. That instead we are a federal republic where the states came together to create a union, and the Electoral College reflects that, where each state has its own electing contest to choose electors, and those people in turn choose the president. So the fact that we have the system that we do does stem from the Republican, small r, character of our union.
Okay, good. Now, Tom, you obviously get involved in this all the time. So the question I ask you is, Electoral College, should we change it?
Well, I personally would prefer just having a straight up popular vote rather than having the Electoral College. But I also think that that kind of change is very unlikely because it's going to require a constitutional amendment. Although there's one possibility, which we'll talk about later, where maybe we can avoid amending the Constitution. But I think the straight up popular vote makes the most sense to everybody. It's the easiest, it's the most intuitive, and it gets rid of some of the major problems of that the Electoral College has. So that's why I personally prefer that.
You know, one of the things that I found out last night when I was preparing for our discussion was there's actually been 700 attempts to amend the Constitution just on this issue, which just shows how highly unlikely it might be for that to happen.
Right.
Yeah. Well, talk to us about, because that's a good point, Jim. Talk to us about the amending of the Constitution. Number one, why it would have to be amended to go to the popular vote, at least I assume that it does, and then let that viewer know what the process is and why you think it would be difficult because of the process.
The process for an amendment.
Yeah, for the process to put an amendment in to change
Right.
it. Yeah.
I mean, well, the Electoral College is in the Constitution, so it specifies how these presidential elections are going to happen. So in order to have any other sort of electoral mechanism, we're going to have to change the language of the Constitution. And we haven't done that in quite some time, and it's incredibly difficult to do by design. The founders wanted to give future generations some flexibility to change things, but they also didn't want to make it really, really easy. So it's worked exactly sort of as designed. So this would require basically super majorities in almost every state in order to amend the Constitution. And so, but basically what it really needs is bipartisan support, right? So you'd have to have a
What is that?
Define that for us.
Right.
What is that concept you're talking about?
From history.
That existed a long time ago.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So it's going to have bipartisan support in order for it ever to happen, and that's very, very unlikely, just like any political reform, right? Because any political reform is probably going to advantage one party over the other, and so naturally you're going to have a natural situation where one party is going to be opposed to the reform and one party's in favor of it. And so unless we're in some situation where both parties agree we should scrap the Electoral College, that'd be the only situation where it would be likely to happen.
But Tom, you mentioned that there's perhaps another way to jerry-rig around this.
Right. It's called the National Popular Vote Compact, and this is kind of a clever way of getting around amending the Constitution by instead of having each state assign its electors to the person who won the popular vote in their own state. Each state agrees in this compact, right? They pass a state law that says when there's enough states that have passed the same state law to reach 270, that's the magic number in the Electoral College, then this law takes effect, which says now our state, whatever that state is, Texas, will pledge all of its electors to whichever candidate wins the national popular vote.
Now, this hasn't happened yet.
No, it has not happened yet. There's like 16 or so states that have passed this state law, so it's sort of happening, but they need another, I think, about 80 or so Electoral College votes. So it's not really even close to happening. But it's kind of a very clever workaround to enacting a national popular vote without amending the Constitution.
Yeah. Now, Matt, he was in the popular vote. I don't know if you're interested in that or not, but what is it about the Electoral College that makes people want to change it? Have we had elections that are different from what he's talking about, or what are let's just say, the problems with the structure as we have it today?
Well, one thing that makes people want to change it is it's a little bit complicated. It requires some level of civics knowledge to understand the dynamics of the system, and just a straightforward national popular vote would be simpler. The important thing to remember, though, is that as our elections are currently administered, quote unquote, the popular vote is really a fictional entity. There is no national popular vote because we do not have a uniform system of election administration across the country. And what I mean is every state sets its own electoral rules. So in some states, the polls are open for more hours than they are in other states. In some states, you can register on the day of the election. Other states, you have to register months ahead of time. Some states have a Senate or a gubernatorial election at the same time that they're choosing the president. Other states don't. So all of those variations mean that we have to be really careful about just totaling up the presidential votes cast in all 51 jurisdictions and saying that's the national popular vote. Moreover, of course, if we did have a single national popular vote system, it would change the way that the candidates campaigned and allocated their resources and things like that.
I'd like you to go more in talking about that with the popular vote, because one of my concerns has always been if you went to that, people would campaign in 10 cities.
Well, they would. I don't think it'd be 10 cities, but I think it would make campaigns incredibly more expensive, right? Because now you have to, rather than focusing on, with the Electoral College, you could narrow your focus to say 8 or 10 swing states, right? They would forget about the other 40, right? We never have campaigns in Texas because we know who's going to win ahead of time. But if we went to a national popular vote, well, now they're going to have to come to Dallas, to Houston, to Austin, to San Antonio.
But they're going to go to major cities.
Yeah, they are. But I mean, you don't go to where people aren't because there's nobody there, right? There's no votes there. And so, rural areas want to have more power, but they don't have very many people. And so, how much power do we want to give a place where nobody lives? You know what I'm saying? If there's only a handful of people, they should have as much power as they have people.
Well, but we're a republic, and each state is supposed to have a say on this.
And this was one of the concerns of the smaller states at the time of the Constitutional Convention. They were very wary of signing on to a constitution that would diminish the representation and role of the smaller states. And so, I mean, this has been a battle that has been going on since the inception of the American Republic, is to what extent do we need to protect and preserve the interests of smaller states so they don't get overwhelmed by larger states, versus to what extent do we need to respect the majoritarian.
Well, and that gets back to what you just said about different states have different ways of voting. And I'm thinking in a republic that may be the appropriate thing. Get the laboratories in these states, seeing what works for them, and not have in just one particular federal law under your system, Tom, where it says every state, because you would have to do that under national popular vote, would you not? You'd have a federal election commission, as if we needed one more, maybe it's the same one we have right now.
Right.
Saying that every state has to do it this way, wouldn't you?
I don't think necessarily you would. I mean, it might follow sort of logically, but I don't. And Matt's totally right that there are variations across these states, but I disagree with him that we really don't have a national popular vote. I don't really have any problem kind of adding up the votes, understanding that Michigan might only have 1 day of voting, whereas Ohio might have 30 days in which they could vote. If Michigan wants to change, they can change. They can add early voting if they want to.
Can you imagine though what would happen if we had to have a national recount?
That would be bad. Yeah, that would be bad.
Well, and just put yourself in this position. Let's say that you had 130 million votes, and somehow, 50,000 votes made the difference. I don't know how you would get around. And of course, I'm sorry, but a lot of friends of mine say there's no such thing as voter fraud. And to them, I say, I don't know what you're smoking, but you're not doing the right thing. There is voter fraud in this country, as we know. Maybe a large amount, maybe a small amount, but it seems to me we would set ourselves up for maybe even a different kind of voter fraud, wouldn't we? Or am I missing something?
Well, possibly. I mean, most of the studies in political science have suggested that voter fraud does exist, but it's fairly small scale. It's unlikely to be of a magnitude that would change the outcome of a national election. But if we were to have a single national popular vote system, that would change the incentives surrounding voter fraud. It might decrease it, it might increase it, depends on kind of the strategic calculation of different candidates, but it would certainly change, as to go back to your original question, the campaign focus and where people were campaigning. And we might see, under a national popular vote system, a lot more presidential campaigning in Texas. Certainly a state like New Hampshire or New Mexico would see a lot less campaigning.
And it's not just campaigning. We're talking about how much money is spent on media, too.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's part and parcel of campaigning, is the amount of money that candidates spend on events, the amount of money that they spend on television and radio ads. There's a financial dimension that goes along with that.
Well, I'm also happy to say, Jim, as you know, we're going to do another program pretty soon on this American Promise thing to try to get money out of politics. That's a whole nother thing that may or may not be possible.
That may be a longer show. I want to be sure we do spend a little bit of time, though, talking about faithless electors. So I've been reading about that, and tell our viewers what it is, and are you beginning to see more of that?
Go ahead.
Okay. So electors, the Electoral College is comprised of actual people, and that's technically who we're voting for. We're voting for these people to then go cast the ballot in January in the state capitol. And so a faithless elector is somebody who doesn't vote for the person who won the vote in the state. Okay, so because they don't have to, they can vote for whomever they want, quite frankly. And so there have been instances, right, including I think there were 7 faithless electors in the last election alone, which was relatively high.
And both representing both parties.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so these people, but traditionally they've really just been kind of more of a protest. A lot of times these faithless electors are voting faithlessly to kind of show, hey, I can do this, and the system is broken.
And whether or not they can do it is prescribed by law. Certain states prohibit it.
Yes, some states prohibit it, although I think there was that was tested in Washington where they actually fined the electors. I think this is right. And a court struck that state law down,
Right.
if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it's not clear that there actually exists the constitutional authority to penalize an elector for casting his or her vote however he or she sees fit.
And probably if they did it, they won't be invited back to be an elector.
Well, that's a safe bet.
one time.
But yeah, faithless electors have never changed the outcome of a presidential election.
All right, but speaking of changing an outcome, however, as I recall, back in, was it 68 when George Wallace was a big factor? So you have George Wallace, let's say, or in 92, Ross Perot. Under certain circumstances with the present system, tell me if I'm wrong about this, that the if they got some electoral votes, they could in fact broker who was the president under certain circumstances with an independent candidate. Am I missing something there?
Well, I think what you're missing is that it would go to the House of Representatives in that case. And so the third party candidate himself or herself would not be able to direct that outcome. So if no one has a majority in the Electoral College, then the House of Representatives gets to decide. And as we know, virtually everyone in the House of Representatives is either a Democrat or a Republican. So if the election goes to the House of Representatives, the chance of a third party candidate being chosen are pretty minimal.
Yes. Now, I don't mean being chosen. I mean, if they decide to sway their people, are they able to give their electoral votes to one candidate
You
or
mean the
other?
independent?
Huh? Yeah, the independent person I'm talking about, Ross Perot, let's say, if he had gotten electoral votes, would he be able to give his to one or the other?
Well, did he get any electoral
No,
votes?
he did not.
He did not.
He didn't win a single state. In fact, he only came in second in one state. So he came in third in 49 of 50 states.
So affected the popular vote.
Right, absolutely. So I think that they could pledge them, Dennis, but I don't think that they have a legal...
Okay, but that's a good point. So let's say they pledged them, and so they went in there and so they had enough to make a difference. So nobody got 270, and let's say they had a difference of 20, let's say,
Right.
and they could pledge one to the other, effectively buying themselves some
Sure, presumably they'd get some
favors, let's
right,
say.
yeah, right.
Well, here's how it would get complicated, though. They could instruct or suggest to their electors,
Yes.
don't vote for me, vote for candidate X or candidate Y. However, their electors are under no obligation to follow that instruction. So if Ross Perot had won electoral votes, theoretically he could have said, you know what, vote for George Bush or vote for Bill Clinton, don't vote for me. But the pledged Perot electors could have said, well, Ross, thank you for your opinion, but that's not what I'm doing. I prefer Bush or I prefer Clinton. So, you know, they could weigh in, but it's not a binding commitment.
So what we saw in 2000 and 2016, clearly the Republican candidate won the greater number of electoral votes and lost a popular vote. So can we then assume then that the Electoral College favors the Republican Party?
I think at the moment it's pretty clear that it does. And in large part, it's mainly just because of California. I mean, California has so many people and so many Democrats and not enough Republicans that the surplus of votes that the Democratic candidate is going to get there is going to be large, right? And so that can outweigh the gap in the other 49 states relatively easily, like it did in 2016. And so I don't think there's any reason to think that the Republicans won't continue to be advantaged in 2020.
What about Maine and Nebraska? They seem to be outliers for some reason. Matt, why is that? What is that?
They've chosen to allocate their electoral votes differently from the way that the other states do it. So the Constitution gives each state legislature the right to determine how electors are going to be chosen within their state. And in fact, for much of American history, many of the state legislatures just chose the electors without having a popular vote within the state. That's still constitutionally their prerogative to do. No state does that anymore. But within that, you know, when we have a presidential election in a state, most states say whoever wins the most votes in this state gets all of the state's electors. But they don't have to do that. Maine and Nebraska have chosen to do it differently and to say whoever wins statewide gets the 2 electoral votes that come from our state's senators, and then whoever wins in each of our congressional districts gets the 1 electoral vote that comes from that congressional district. Now, because it's Maine and Nebraska, it's just a quirk because Nebraska has 5 electoral votes, Maine has 4, so there are only a very small number of different permutations you could get with regard to that. But imagine if Texas or California or New York or Florida were to adopt that system. I mean, even in a state as democratic as California, there are multiple Republican majority districts. Or in a state that's Republican like Texas, there are multiple Democratic majority districts. So if we divided it that way, or if California did, it would really make a strategic difference in the outcome of elections.
Well, I think that's correct, and that's one of the reasons some people would like to change it, obviously.
That's right.
And yet, we've never had, well, I say that, maybe, was it 1800 or 1825? Did it go to the House at one time?
Twice.
Twice, in 1801 and 1800 and 1824, right?
I think that's right.
Went to the House twice, but it hadn't gone to the House since. So what would something going to the House really look like, Tom, number one? And secondly, we were, I should say, formed as a republic. It seems to me that we've moved way away from that toward a democracy. Your national popular vote would move it way further to a democracy, it seems to me, than a republic.
So what does that do to states' right on other issues?
Exactly right. How does that affect all that in your estimation?
Well, so on your first question about the House, I think if we had a contingent election, which again I think Professor Gilson talked about on the last show, the founders expected most of the presidential elections to be decided in the House, right? Because they didn't think we would just have two people running getting electoral college votes. So when you have 3, 4, 5 people getting electoral college votes, getting a pure majority is really, really hard to do. So they expected it to go to the House, and if it goes to the House, every state gets exactly one vote, right? And so I think if it ever happens again, I think first the public is going to be stunned. Like, this is really the way we do it, right? And of course, small states people are going to be happy, and large state people are going to be like, what is this, right? Why does Wyoming get one vote and New York and Texas all only get one vote? And so it's also difficult because, imagine if you have a state with two members of Congress, and one's a Democrat, one's a Republican, right? How are they going to decide, right? It's going to be incredibly difficult for them to do. And it was in 1800. I mean, I think they voted dozens of times, right, over a whole week before they finally selected Jefferson. So, it would be straight partisanship. And I think the only questions would be, in those states where there was even numbers of Democrats and Republicans, but everything else I think would just fall.
Tell us more a little bit about the process and the timeline, because we vote first Tuesday.
Right.
And then what happens?
And then the electors meet in each of the 50 state capitals in early January. And then
within a certain period of time?
Yeah, no, it's on a specific date.
Okay.
In January, so about a month, 6 weeks later, and then they transmit the results to the United States Senate, who opens it a couple weeks later. I can't remember.
January or December now?
It might be December.
Oh, it has to be December. Sorry.
Yeah,
it's December now, yeah.
Right, in January.
And then essentially then the Senate certifies.
That's right. That's right.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it would be interesting to watch what would happen if we had a national popular vote. Do you think we'd have more than 2 political parties at some time, Tom? Matt?
Go ahead, Matt.
Well, so yeah, here's something that we'd have to think about. People who are asking for a shift to a national popular vote election, be careful what you wish for, because there'll be a variety of consequences that we'd have to reckon with that. One of them would be, would we require a runoff? Because let's say 6 different people run for president, no one gets a majority of the national popular vote. Would we have to create a runoff system?
So we're getting rid of the primary system.
Well, maybe,
not.
Sort of, right? I mean, a lot would be in play.
The primary system continues, except
right,
at the general
Those
election.
newspapers and TV stations need the revenue.
But what it would mean is, so let's say candidate A wins the Republican nomination, candidate B wins the Democratic nomination. Right. There would be less incentive for the people who fell just short of those nominations to drop out, right? They could continue on as independent candidates in the fall, hoping to push the election to the House of Representatives. Then who knows who gets chosen, right? In this one respect, the Electoral College is a majoritarian institution in that it tends to create majorities within the Electoral College. And what I mean is, in 1992, Bill Clinton did not win a majority of the national vote.
It was about 43% or something, right?
In 1968, Richard Nixon did not win a majority of the national popular vote. He won a plurality. But both Clinton and Nixon won Electoral College majorities, so it didn't go to the House of Representatives. But if you have multiple candidates running, there's a fair chance nobody's going to get 50% of the national popular vote, which means we'd have to figure out, what do we do?
Yeah, what do we do, Tom? You're the guy.
Well, yeah, well, I would do what's called instant runoff voting. So when we vote in America, we don't get very much information from the voter, right? We say, here's a list of candidates, mark the one that you like the most, right? Well, as long as we're there, why don't we ask them some more stuff? Like, instead of just giving us your top pick, why don't you rank all of these people for us?
I got it.
Right? And then if we need to have a runoff, we don't actually have to have another election. We just use the instant runoff system, which basically, in a nutshell, you drop the lowest vote getter out of the thing, reallocate all the votes for the voters who picked that person first to their second choices, right? And we keep doing that until somebody gets a majority.
But again, but to do this, you're going to have a constitutional amendment, right?
Yes.
Good luck.
Right, yeah, it's very difficult to do, right.
Well, I think it, as we've seen in history in this thing, strange things have happened. I mean, in 2000, when there were, if I had said to you, the both of you, all three of you, in the year 2000, what's going to happen this fall is going to have to do with hanging chads. Would you have believed me?
No.
No. Okay.
Right.
So we would not. We didn't know who Chad was, much less he was going to hang him. We knew,
But I can
knew
still
nothing
picture
about
that image.
Yeah.
Right.
Can't you? I mean, and so you just never know what's gonna happen as a result of what we have. But you're exactly right. We, at least through the Electoral College, we do have a majority. That 270 has to be there.
Right.
In some point, where's the popular vote deal?
But in reality today, the only thing that really has some traction is this national popular vote interstate compact.
Yes. And like I said, it'd be interesting to see. There's actually some questions about whether or not it's constitutional, actually. So even if we got where enough states passed this state law so they were part of this compact.
Go to Supreme Court. And
Yeah, the Constitution actually forbids state compacts between states.
Without the approval of Congress.
Yeah, right, exactly. So
and Congress would not approve this.
Presumably not the current Congress.
yeah, right.
I am glad we have not decided on this, and I know you're glad about it too, because now you've heard what we hope are most, if not all, the options to the Electoral College. So, in your opinion, should the Electoral College be changed, and if so, how? Now, if you missed the program on its history, please go to McCuistionTV.com to view it, and then make up your mind and stay involved in this issue. As always, we appreciate your inviting us in to talk about things that matter with people who care, and keep voting for us. Thank you so much.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email Nikki N at NikkiMcCuistion.com. Visit our website at www.McCuistionTV.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McCuistionTV or download McCuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.